America invited these men into its living rooms, as fathers, doctors, lawyers, officers, comedians, and harmless eccentrics. Yet some of television's safest images were built around lives the industry could not explain. One beloved father carried a truth that might have shattered a wholesome family fantasy. A legendary courtroom star left a biography that later researchers could not verify. And one outrageous puppet seemed able to say what her creator still feared saying for himself. Tell us where you are watching from, and what time it is there right now. Paul Lynde. He became one of television's most recognizable comic personalities without ever pretending to be ordinary. That was the camouflage. On Bewitched, Uncle Arthur arrived with a raised eyebrow, a cutting remark, and the kind of theatrical mischief that could hijack a scene in seconds. On Hollywood Squares, Lynde occupied the center square so memorably that the position became part of his public identity. The strange part was not that audiences saw nothing. They saw almost everything except an official explanation. Lynde's delivery was camp sharp and loaded with double meanings. Many jokes played directly with expectations about masculinity, romance, and desire. In Hollywood, his homosexuality was widely understood, but mainstream television culture could absorb those signals as a comic style while leaving the private man unnamed. That distinction mattered. Lynde was not a performer who survived by building a conventionally masculine screen image. He survived by making his difference funny enough to become marketable, and there was more behind the laugh track. Biographers have described the frustration Lynde felt about hiding his sexuality, even as his career depended on a PH and persona audiences could read in different ways. A 1,976 People profile, for example, referred to Stan Finesmith as his hairstylist, sweet mate, and bodyguard language that came close to suggesting intimacy without actually defining it. Lynde never staged a public coming out during his lifetime. He died in 1982 at age 55 after a heart attack. By then, America had spent years laughing with a man whose comic voice was impossible to miss, while the culture around him still treated the truth behind that voice as something better left implied. The audience could recognize the code without television ever translating it aloud. That is why Lynde belongs first. His role was not a disguise because it looked straight. The disguise was the joke itself, and the next performer made that paradox even stranger. He was so flamboyant that invisibility became almost impossible, yet acknowledgement still lagged behind recognition. Charles Nelson Reilly. If Paul Lynde turned implication into a weapon, Reilly made implication practically impossible to ignore. On Match Game, the huge glasses, theatrical voice, extravagant reactions, and rapid double entendres became television furniture. His hypervisibility became its own disguise. But the game show version of Reilly concealed something else too, how accomplished he was. Before millions knew him as the wild panelist laughing beside Brett Somers, Reilly had built a theater career. In 1962, he won the Tony Award for Featured Actor in a musical for playing Bud Frump in How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. He later worked as a director and teacher, carrying far more theatrical authority than the television caricature suggested. That difference gives his story its tension. Profiles during the height of his game show fame avoided discussing his private life. Years later, Reilly spoke openly about being gay, including through his autobiographical stage work. He also said he had not felt that he was deliberately hiding himself. That is an important distinction. The silence was not always created by one frightened actor inventing a false identity. Sometimes the surrounding culture simply refused to translate what it was already seeing. Reilly could joke about masculinity, exaggerate camp mannerisms, and play with the audience's assumptions every week. Television accepted the performance because it was funny. The biography remained another matter. So, the old Match Game clips now feel almost surreal. Nothing about Reilly seems invisible. The concealment existed in the gap between recognition and language. And after two men protected by flamboyance, the next figure shows the opposite strategy, entirely disappearing into respectability. Richard Deacon. He did not disappear through flamboyance. He disappeared by looking completely useful, respectable, and safe. On The Dick Van Dyke Show, Deacon played Mel Cooley, the bald, bespectacled producer forever caught between Alan Brady's ego and the writers around him. On Leave It to Beaver, he was Fred Rutherford, an authority figure among fathers, neighbors, offices, and routine. Those roles mattered because they rarely asked viewers to imagine Deacon as a romantic center. He was the boss, the father, the neighbor, the comic obstacle. That made him easy to know and easy not to question. The surviving record of Deacon's private life is less direct than the record for men such as George Takei or Dick Sargent. Deacon did not leave behind a documented public coming-out statement. Instead, later scholarship has identified him as gay and placed him among closeted performers working in Hollywood for decades afterward. That distinction should remain visible. Later, scholarship is not the same thing as first-person testimony. What we can see clearly is the screen image. Deacon's specialty was social respectability with a comic edge. He looked like the man who belonged in the meeting, the neighborhood, or the family room. In that sense, ordinary television usefulness became camouflage, and the next story turns that idea inside out. Television imagined the future of social progress, while the actor helping create it still had to negotiate the limits of his own present. George Takei, Star Trek offered one of television's promises: humanity could outgrow ancient prejudice. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Takei's Hikaru Sulu was capable and part of the future. A Japanese-American actor was helping millions of viewers imagine a more integrated world during the 1960s. But Takei himself was still navigating rules that future had not solved. His understanding of institutions and identity began long before Hollywood. In 1942, when he was a child, Takei and his family were forcibly removed from their Los Angeles home. They were confined first at Santa Anita, then at Rower in Arkansas, and later at Tule Lake in California. He has spent decades describing that incarceration as a defining lesson about what happens when a government decides a group does not fully belong. That experience should not be equated with the closet. The histories are different, but both informed Takei's later concern with who gets to live openly inside American public life. For years, the actor known around the world as Sulu did not publicly identify himself as gay. He later explained that he feared what disclosure could do to his career. By 2005, he had already been with Brad Altman for nearly 2 decades when he publicly came out, prompted in part by California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's veto of same-sex marriage legislation. Then the story changed direction. Takei became an outspoken advocate for marriage equality and LGBTQ rights. In 2008, after California temporarily opened marriage to same-sex couples, Takei and Altman married in Los Angeles. Star Trek colleagues Walter Koenig and Nichelle Nichols participated in the ceremony. That makes the old Enterprise bridge look different now. Television could imagine humanity crossing galaxies, mixing cultures and overcoming old divisions. Yet one of the men embodying that, Future believed honesty about his own life might threaten the career that put him there. The contradiction was not in science fiction. It was in the studio system surrounding it. And the next actor stepped into something even more conventional television's safest suburban marriage. Dick Sargent. When Sargent joined Bewitched in its 6th season as the second Darren Stevens, he became television's normal husband. Darren was a suburban homeowner, advertising executive, father and mortal, surrounded by witches. The magic was supposed to be strange. He was supposed to represent ordinary heterosexual life. That is what makes the role so revealing in retrospect. Sargent had spent years building a career inside an industry where openly gay actors had reason to fear lost work. He later said that he had lived with one male companion for more than 20 years before that partner died in 1979. Yet viewers watching him argue with Endora kiss Samantha and worry about the neighbors were not invited to imagine that private reality. For years, the contradiction remained outside the frame. Then, in 1991, Sargent publicly came out as gay on National Coming Out Day. He explained that concern over the high suicide rate among gay young people helped motivate him. He called himself a retroactive role model. That phrase matters because Sargent was not trying to rewrite Darren into a gay character. He was asking audiences to look backward at the rate an actor they already knew and understand that gay people had always been present inside familiar American television, even when the industry kept that fact unspoken. His former co-star Elizabeth Montgomery stood beside him in that chapter. In 1992, the two served as Grand Marshals of the Los Angeles Gay Pride Parade, turning a television partnership into an act of support. Sargent died in 1994 from prostate cancer. And now the old Bewitched premise acquires an irony nobody needed to invent. The Stevens household could survive witches, spells, transformations, and impossible relatives. The actor playing its husband still had to wait decades before publicly naming an ordinary truth about himself. The next story is gentler. It belongs to a man whose character spent years trying to expose someone else's secret. Hayden Rorke. On I Dream of Jeannie, Dr. Alfred Bellows had one exhausting mission: figure out what Major Tony Nelson was hiding. Week after week, the psychiatrist noticed impossible behavior, followed clues, demanded explanations, and somehow never reached the supernatural truth. Off-screen, Rourke's own private life drew far less public attention. Barbara Eden later wrote that Rourke was gay, and lived for many years with television director Justice Addis in Studio City. Later, biographical work has described their relationship as lasting decades. Unlike several stories in this video, there is no need to force that fact into a tale of scandal or catastrophe. Bellows was fussy, exasperated, respectable, and basically decent. He was not sold as a romantic fantasy for millions of viewers. That kind of supporting status could create its own privacy. The irony survives in the reruns. Bellows spent episodes trying to uncover the hidden explanation, while audiences were rarely encouraged to wonder much about the man playing Bellows. Rorke died in 1987. His story gives this history room to breathe. Concealment did not always produce a spectacular public rupture. Sometimes a long domestic life simply existed beside a famous television career without becoming part of the audience's picture. But the next man had almost no such distance from his role. America knew him as the father, at the center of one of television's most wholesome homes. Robert Reed. For millions of viewers, Mike Brady was television fatherhood made reassuring. He was calm, educated, dependable, married to Carol, and surrounded by 6 children inside that famous suburban house. The Brady Bunch turned him into a symbol of blended family stability at the exact moment Reed's own private life had to remain carefully separated from that image. Reed was gay, but he never publicly came out during his lifetime to the wider public. People who worked with him later described the pressure surrounding that secrecy. Florence Henderson said she did not believe the Brady Bunch could have existed in that era if the public had known Reed was gay. Even decades later, co-star Eve Plum said she had not known. That tells you how complete the compartmentalization could be. Reed's life was more complicated than the sitcom image in other ways. He was a serious, classically trained actor who often battled producers over scripts and quality. After the Brady Bunch, he earned recognition for dramatic work, including an Emmy-nominated performance in Roots. The genial father was never the whole performer. Then came a second revelation after his death. Reed died on the 12th of May 1992 at age 59. The immediate cause listed was colon lymphoma. When details from his death certificate became public, they also showed that he was HIV positive. His doctor listed HIV infection as a significant condition contributing to his death. Reed did not have an AIDS diagnosis, so reducing the story to the phrase "died of AIDS" is inaccurate. The timing gave that disclosure enormous emotional weight. In the early 1990s, HIV still carried intense stigma, and Reed had protected both his sexuality and his medical condition from public view. Now return to the Brady living room. Mike Brady represented safety, paternal wisdom, and the promise that a complicated family could be made whole through understanding. The actor giving that image its authority lived in a culture that offered him far less room to make his own life visible. That is the contradiction the reruns cannot erase. And after The Perfect Father comes a softer case, one where the surviving record itself demands restraint. Billy DeWolfe. DeWolfe specialized in a very particular comic presence. Precise diction, elegant fussiness supporting characters who could puncture a scene without ever becoming its romantic center. He worked opposite Doris Day in films including Tea for Two and Lullaby of Broadway. His screen type made him memorable while keeping the private man easy to overlook. Here, however, the evidence requires more caution than it does with figures such as George Takei or Dick Sargent. DeWolfe never delivered a documented public coming-out statement. Later, books and commentary have described or alluded to him as a closeted gay man, including biographical writing about Doris Day and other Hollywood figures. That is meaningful evidence, but it is not the same as a first-person declaration. So there is no responsible reason to invent a secret romance, a hidden scandal, or a dramatic revelation. What survives most clearly is the public type. DeWolfe was the polished comic foil, the fussy friend, the supporting presence whose exaggerated manner could be enjoyed without inviting mainstream audiences to ask what it reflected off-screen. That uncertainty is part of the history, too. Not every private life left a clean paper trail. And the next man left the opposite problem, an enormous public biography that later researchers found increasingly. Raymond Burr. Perry Mason made Burr synonymous with exposing stories that did not survive questioning. He listened, he waited. Then he found the contradiction that changed the case. Years later, parts of Burr's own public biography would receive a surprisingly similar examination. By the late 1950s, Burr had become one of television's great figures of authority. Perry Mason was brilliant, controlled, and almost impossible to fool. Later on, Ironside Burr again played competence and command, Audiences trusted him. For viewers, however, Raymond Burr remained the solemn bachelor hero whose authority seemed completely self-contained on screen. But his private history was more difficult to pin down. During his career, Burr gave accounts of marriages, bereavement, and a son who supposedly died young. After his death, biographers and researchers revisited those stories. One marriage was real and documented. Burr married actress Isabella Ward in 1948, and the marriage later ended in divorce. But researchers found no supporting evidence for two other marriages he described, or for the son he said had died of leukemia. That does not mean every remembered detail from a complicated life can be reduced to a courtroom verdict. It does mean those claims should be described as disputed, rather than repeated as established fact. Then there was the relationship his public image rarely acknowledged. Around 1960, Burr met actor Robert Benavides on the set of Perry Mason. Benavides later left acting, worked with Burr professionally, and became his longtime partner. They shared a life for more than 3 decades, including business ventures such as an orchid operation and a California vineyard. Burr left his estate to Benavides when he died in 1993. Now, the old Mason image acquires an extraordinary irony. One of American television's most trusted men built a career around truth evidence and contradictions while maintaining a private life and public biography that demanded careful separation. Why construct such elaborate stories? We cannot know every motive. But the Hollywood system of Burr's era gave powerful incentives to protect the heterosexual image of a leading man. Perry Mason asked audiences to distrust stories that did not add up. Burr's own history eventually invited the same question. And after that investigation comes something warmer. A relationship that lasted quietly for decades before the law finally allowed a wedding. Nabors. Gomer Pyle seemed almost designed to make suspicion impossible. On The Andy Griffith Show, and then Gomer Pyle, USMC Nabors played the cheerful, naive gas station attendant turned Marine whose wide grin, gentle manners, and famous exclamations made him one of television's most innocent comic figures. Then Nabors would sing. The contrast between Gomer's high country speaking voice and Nabors' rich baritone startled audiences and became another part of his appeal. Yet the more important contrast was not a scandal at all. For decades, Nabors shared his life with Stan Cadwallader, a former Honolulu firefighter. In January 2013, after Washington state legalized same-sex marriage, the two married in Seattle. Nabors said they had been together for 38 years. He was 82. That simple fact changes the emotional temperature of this story. The hidden life was not necessarily a series of secret affairs or tabloid disasters. It was a long relationship that existed for decades before the law and public culture made marriage possible. An old rumor claimed Nabors secretly married Rock Hudson, but both men denied it, and no marriage occurred. The real story is quieter and more durable. Gomer Pyle represented innocence so completely that viewers were rarely asked to imagine any adult romantic life behind him. But Nabors had one, and it lasted. After the courtroom mythology of Raymond Burr, Nabors offers something almost radical in its ordinariness: love, privacy, patience, and finally legal recognition. The next man faced a different pressure. Hollywood did not sell him as harmless. It sold him as a dream. Richard Chamberlain. For a generation of viewers, Richard Chamberlain was not merely famous. He was sold as desire itself. Dr. Kildare made him a television heartthrob in the early 1960s. Later came prestige miniseries and sweeping romantic dramas including Shogun and the Thornbirds. Chamberlain's face appeared on magazine covers, and millions of women were encouraged to imagine him as the elegant, sensitive, available leading man. That image had commercial value. It also had a cost. That made silence not just personal protection, but part of Hollywood's marketing machinery too. Chamberlain was gay, but for most of his career he believed public honesty could damage the fantasy that made him bankable. He later recalled being frightened that the truth might come out while fan magazines constantly asked about his love life. The pressure was not abstract. His star image depended heavily on heterosexual romantic possibility. Behind that public construction, Chamberlain had a long relationship with actor, director, and producer Martin Rabbitt. Their life together became part of the story. Chamberlain eventually told more openly. In 2003, approaching 70, he confirmed that he was gay in his memoir Shattered Love. The disclosure did not erase the earlier decades. Instead, it reframed them. Audiences could suddenly look back at Dr. Kildare, the romantic priest Ralph de Bricquissart in The Thornbirds, and the adventure hero of Shogun, and see how much labor had gone into maintaining the star around the actor. Chamberlain later spoke about the freedom that came with greater honesty, while also acknowledging the fear that had shaped his choices. He died in Hawaii on the 29th of March 2025, at age 90 from complications of a stroke. Rabbit was with him in the final chapter of his life. The old heartthrob photographs now carry a second story. Hollywood was not simply asking Chamberlain to act heterosexual on screen. It was selling his supposed availability as part of the product. That is a more expensive disguise than a costume. And after a star built as romantic perfection comes a comedian who made everything too chaotic to hold still long enough for explanation. Alan Sues. Laugh-In moved like television with its breaks removed. Quick cuts, costumes, one-liners. Characters appeared exploded and vanished before anyone could examine them too closely. Alan Sues fit that rhythm perfectly. His camp style was not subtle. As Big Al, the sportscaster Uncle Al, the kiddies' pal, and other exaggerated characters, Sues could stretch voice, gesture, and masculinity into broad comedy. The audience had seconds to laugh before the show rushed somewhere else. That speed became its own kind of deniability. Later reporting and obituaries identified Sues as gay. Accounts also noted that he did not publicly discuss it during the period when Laugh-In made him nationally recognizable, in part because he feared open disclosure could cost him work. The important point is not that viewers were somehow fooled by perfect camouflage. They were watching camp performance on a hugely popular network comedy before gay identity could be discussed with equal ease. Every gesture belonged to a joke. Every joke disappeared into the next cut. That allowed recognition without explanation. Sues had also been briefly married earlier, so Laugh-In becomes more interesting now, not less. The chaos let television show something culturally legible while pretending no translation was required. And then the rhythm changes completely. The next actor was a handsome soap and prime time star, until one medical result forced a decision that secrecy could no longer postpone. Dack Rambo. By the 1980s, Rambo looked like the kind of man television knew exactly how to sell. Handsome, polished, and conventionally masculine, he moved through primetime and daytime drama with roles on Dallas, All My Children, and Another World. He played men designed to be watched romantically. Then in 1991, one medical result changed the structure of his life. Rambo was working on Another World when he learned that he had tested positive for HIV. He finished taping that day, then told the producers about his diagnosis, and said he wanted to leave the series. Contemporary reporting made an important point. The departure was his decision, not a dismissal forced on him by the show. That distinction gives Rambo's story a different shape from most of the men before him. Instead of remaining silent for decades and having the truth emerge after death, Rambo chose public disclosure. In October 1991, he announced that he was HIV positive. Soon afterward, in an interview with the Washington Post, he identified himself as bisexual. That word matters. Rambo did not publicly identify as exclusively gay, and rewriting him that way would erase the identity he described. He also spoke about addiction recovery, sexual behavior, and the need for education about HIV. His disclosure came during a period when fear and misinformation around AIDS remained intense. Yet he turned the diagnosis into a decision to speak. Rambo died in March 1994 from complications associated with AIDS. He was 52. Now revisit the polished television image. Dallas and the soaps had framed him as a heterosexual sex symbol, a man whose desirability was part of the casting. But when illness forced the private and public worlds together, Rambo did something several earlier figures never had the chance, safety, or desire to do. He named both the diagnosis and his bisexuality himself. That agency is the real reversal. And the next actor brings the volume down again. His story is not about a sudden medical disclosure, but about years of professional caution becoming exhausting. David Stiers. On MASH, Major Charles Emerson Winchester, the third was intelligence wrapped in authority. He was cultivated, precise, and emotionally guarded. Stiers gave Winchester a voice so controlled that even his irritation sounded educated. That voice later became familiar to families through animation, including Disney films such as Beauty and the Beast and Pocahontas. But Stiers eventually explained that family entertainment was part of the reason he had remained so private. In 2009, he publicly acknowledged that he was gay. He said he had feared that openness could damage his work, especially because much of his income came from Disney and other family programming. Instead, he described a fear that had shaped his decisions for years. Then, he gave a reason for speaking. Stiers said he wanted the possibility of finding a partner without forcing that person to live a life of extreme discretion beside him. That statement changes the center of the story. The cost was not only a hypothetical lost job. It was the prospect of asking another person to participate in secrecy. There was no scandal attached to his disclosure. No confrontation. Just a man deciding that caution had occupied enough of his future. Winchester now looks different in reruns. The character's reserve polish and emotional discipline were part of the performance, not evidence of Stiers' private thoughts. But the image makes a fitting contrast. For years, Stiers was valued for control. Eventually, control itself became something he was ready to loosen. And the final story turns that idea into a visual metaphor, a performer standing beside a creation that seemed freer than he was. Wayland Flowers. He stood beside Madame, but Madame seemed to own the room. The puppet flirted, insulted celebrities, bragged about lovers, delivered sexual jokes, and behaved with a freedom that mainstream television rarely gave people. Flowers called himself an illusionist rather than a ventriloquist because he made no effort to hide that he was supplying the voice. The illusion was that audiences stopped watching him and watched her. That becomes the perfect image for this entire story. Flowers built his act in clubs and cabarets, including gay venues, before Madame crossed into television through programs such as Hollywood Squares, Solid Gold, and eventually Madame's Place. The character became a celebrity, yet Flowers' own public language about identity was more complicated than later summaries sometimes suggest. In a 1982 interview with the Bay Area Reporter, he resisted being pushed into a fixed label and questioned why everyone needed one. Accounts have described him as openly gay, but his own surviving words show more hesitation and concern about what explicit labeling might cost professionally. Madame had no such problem. She could say practically anything. Then the story darkened. Flowers was diagnosed with HIV in 1987 and did not publicly announce the diagnosis. He continued performing as his health declined and developed Kaposi's sarcoma and AIDS-related cancer. In September 1988, he collapsed during a performance at Lake Tahoe. Weeks later, on October 11, he died in Los Angeles from complications related to AIDS and Kaposi's sarcoma. He was 48. The final image belongs to the stage. Flowers stands beside Madame, controlling the puppet while allowing her to appear uncontrollable. She could be loud, sexual, outrageous, and shameless in front of America. The man creating the words was more cautious about defining himself publicly. That is why Madame is more than a punchline in this history. She is the metaphor. Classic television remembered the mouth that could say almost anything, while the human being giving it a voice remained far less fully known. Classic television made these men funny, comforting, authoritative, desirable, and unforgettable. But familiarity was never the same as being fully known. Which of these television faces change most for you now after learning the life behind the character and why?